In this video, I'd like to share with you a few details about this protocol called 802.1x, explain why it matters, and a big picture of how it works. So let's use this drawing and let's start with the user like Bob. Now, think about for a moment, how does a user normally get access into the network? There basically is two options. One is they have a networking device that is wired into a device, such as a switch, or they are connected with a wireless adapter through an access point, which in a corporate environment, that's the radio frequencies for the Wi-Fi network. And that access point is connected into a switch, which then leads to a wireless LAN controller, and that's how they get access into the network. So our goal would be, whether it's a wired connection or wireless, it would be ideal if we could identify and authenticate the user Bob before he just goes crazy on the network and starts doing attacks on the network. We want to identify who he is and then control his access once we find out who he is. And there is a standard set of protocols that we can use to do that, and it's referred to as 802.1x, as in X-ray. So by using 802.1x, we have the ability to identify who the user is before we give them access onto the network. And let me explain the basic pieces that are involved in this network authentication and authorization with 802.1x. One element is we're going to have the device that's going to be used for individuals to get on the network. So in this example, it's a switch. Now that could be a multi-layer switch, SWITCH. Great. It could be a multi-layer switch or a layer 2 switch, but this is where the user is connecting into the network. And by default, switches just have ports that are normally assigned as access ports. In a specific VLAN, the user connects and boom, they're on the network. However, what we can do is we can use the role of an authenticator on that switch. Now, an authenticator is simply a fancy way of saying the device who's going to ask the person who's connecting for credentials. So this authenticator running software or being configured to support it, when Bob connects, the authenticator would start asking questions like, hey, I think I need to know who you are and some information about you. So that's the authenticator's role. In this example, it's the switch acting as the authenticator. Now, Bob, the user, doesn't probably know a lot about the details behind the scene when the authenticator, the switch, is asking about who he is. But his computer, if it's running some software, there's a fancy name for it, they call it a supplicant. That software, when it gets these requests from the switch, and sometimes the supplicant can be third-party software, or it can be built in the operating system for the network adapter. In either case, the supplicant running on Bob's computer is going to go ahead and interact and work back and forth with the switch. So in this supplicant, it may prompt the user for their identity, their username and password, for example, or it may be pre-configured with information about Bob or about this device. So as part of 802.1x, we have the authenticator who is asking questions through the 802.1x protocol to the supplicant who's answering those questions. And effectively, if it's the user Bob, that information is communicated over to the authenticator along with the password for Bob. Now, one of the problems is that Bob could be connecting to this switch one day and another switch another day. And how do we centrally manage all that? Well, the third part of the 802.1x is this bad boy right here, the authentication server. So here's what happens. As the supplicant on Bob's computer, the software supplies the information that the authenticator is asking for. Once that information is retrieved, the authenticator is then going to go ahead and forward that over to an identity server. Now in this example, it's going to be ISE, the Identity Services Engine, and the protocol used right here is going to be Radius. So effectively, think of it like the authenticator who says, wow, I know Bob's username, Bob sent me his password, I'm now going to check with the server. It also could be referred to as a AAA server, a Radius server. ISE is an example of a Radius server and AAA server. And then the Radius server, after it checks the credentials, can go ahead and send back a message to the authenticator and say, you know what, Bob checks out, go ahead and give him access on this port right here. And in addition, besides just the authentication of Bob, we could also push down rules regarding authorization as well that state things like, oh yeah, Bob's got this downloadable ACL applied to him, or Bob's supposed to be in VLAN 30 or VLAN 80 or whatever VLAN we want to sign for that port dynamically based on the authorization for Bob who's coming in on that port. Or if we're using a feature called TrustSec, we could also push down to the switch the security groups that Bob is associated with to further enforce policy. So let's summarize the three basic parts of 802.1x authentication for this network authentication and authorization is some type of software that's running at the client acting as a supplicant. Think of a supplicant like supplying the username and password and credentials. The switch, in this example, is acting as the authenticator who's asking for that information. And then the ISE server is acting as the authentication server. where the switch takes that information, ships it over to the authentication server and says, hey, are these credentials all good? And if so, what type of authorization should I allow for this port that the user is trying to connect on? That's the basics of 802.1x. Now, check this out. Not every device that's connecting to our network is going to support a supplicant. Maybe it's an operating system that doesn't have a built-in supplicant. Or maybe it's a device that can't run a supplicant, like a printer or an IP camera or something else. What do we do for that? Well, we can also set up our switches to try 802.1x and say, hey, are you there? Are you there? And if they don't respond using the 802.1x protocols, we can then, after a short timeout, we can then say, you know what, let's go ahead and check out your layer 2 address, your MAC address. And we can do authentication based on a MAC address that's expected. Think of it like this. Think of a security gate with a car coming up, and the guard is looking at the driver and saying, hey, I need all your information. Who are you? The user says, the driver says, I'm Bob. And the security guard looks it up and says, great, yep, you're good to go. Now, that would be an example of 802.1x. However, if we had a device that didn't support 802.1x, it'd be sort of like a car driving up to the security gate and the security guard not paying attention to the driver, just looking at the license plate and saying, yep, that license plate checks out, come on in. And that is referred to as MAC, as in MAC address, MAC Authentication Bypass. We're just going to authenticate them based on the MAC address. It's not as secure as 802.1x, but it's an important feature to be aware of and have for all those devices on our networks that just cannot run a supplicant and participate in 802.1x. So that's what I wanted to drive home in this video, was the concept of 802.1x, finding out who the individual is before letting them on the network, and also, in the absence of 802.1x, using a feature called MAC Authentication Bypass. Now, one other aspect is this. If we do have a client like Bob and his computer, and there is a supplicant there are a lot of options regarding 802.1x that we can choose to use as we talk back and forth between the Authenticator, the switch, supplicant, which is running on the client's computer, and the AAA server. And we're going to take a look at those options, including extensible authentication protocol, in the next video. So I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Hey, thanks for watching, and subscribe right here to get the latest information from CBT Nuggets. And if you're new to or considering a career in the world of IT, head on over to CBT Nuggets and sign up for a free trial.